The Romanian sun hung low and molten, turning the oil fields below into a shimmering sea of black fire. The air trembled with heat and the thunder of engines. At 15,000 feet, Erich Hartmann's Messerschmitt Bf 109G sliced through a sky streaked with contrails and smoke, a steel falcon hunting in a storm of light. From his cockpit, the world looked deceptively still. Beyond the glass canopy, columns of smoke rose from the Ploiești refineries, the Reich's beating heart of fuel, and somewhere above that haze, American Mustangs prowled. 8 silver predators against one man, painted with the black tulip on his nose cone. Hartmann's breath fogged the oxygen mask. His gloved fingers rested lightly on the stick, not gripping, feeling. He knew the sky, like others knew the pulse of a lover. Each vibration, each flicker of sun on aluminum, told him where death waited. Radio chatter hissed in his headset. Clipped, anxious German voices. 8 pints, heading east, heading, altitude 16,000. He answered only with silence. Words slowed thought, and thought could kill. The first P-51 swept out of the sun, guns flickering like a chain of white pearls. Hartmann rolled left, sunlight exploding across his canopy, the roar of 50 caliber rounds shredding air where his tail had been a heartbeat before. He dove through the glare, inverted, the world turning upside down, earth above, sky below, and for a brief moment he flew through fire. Then he was behind them, always behind. 2 bursts, measured, surgical. The first Mustang erupted in orange light. The second spiraled downward, trailing smoke over the burning oil fields. He didn't watch them fall. A third Mustang flashed across his sights. The radio screamed warnings, but his fuel gauge screamed louder, the needle trembling near zero. When 8 Mustangs turned to hunt him, he didn't curse or pray. He throttled back, let the wind howl through the bullet holes in his wings, and whispered to himself, "Fly the fear, not from it." At 2,000 meters, the engine coughed, sputtered, died. Silence filled the cockpit, vast, merciless. He pulled the canopy, felt the rush of air and the cold slap of gravity. The parachute snapped open above him, a white bloom in a sky painted with smoke. Below, the earth burned. Above, one of the American pilots banked gently, came level, and in that brief geometry of humanity, raised his wing in salute. No shots fired, just recognition, one soldier to another, suspended between heaven and war. Hartmann watched him vanish into the light, and for a moment, the sky felt holy again. The battle over Romania was not a dogfight. It was an anatomy of desperation written across the air. The Ploiești oil fields burned day and night, feeding the Luftwaffe's engines, even as they became the Allies' most coveted target. For Germany, every drop of fuel was life. For the Americans, every bomb that reached those refineries was another artery cut. By the summer of 1944, the sky above Romania had turned into a living furnace. Hundreds of bombers thundered in from Italy, escorted by sleek P-51 Mustangs, whose silver wings flashed like blades in the sun. Against them rose the remnants of the once mighty Luftwaffe, thin lines of Messerschmitts, patched together from wrecks, piloted by boys who had never seen peace. Erich Hartmann was not one of those boys. At 22, he was already a legend, whispered across airfields from the Baltic to the Balkans. The Blonde Knight, they called him, though there was nothing romantic about the way he hunted. His kills came without flourish. He attacked from the sun, closed in until the enemy filled his entire windscreen, and fired only when the range was so near that failure was impossible. Then he was gone, a ghost leaving only black smoke behind. On that burning afternoon above Ploiești, the air shimmered with heat and oil fumes. Hartmann's section climbed through scattered cumulus, 4 Messerschmitts moving like shadows along the cloud line. From his altitude, he could see the bombers, the great dark carpet of B-24 Liberators crawling toward the refineries. Their contrails wove white scars across the blue. The escorts, the Mustangs, orbited high, patient and predatory. Hartmann spoke quietly into the radio. "Target bombers. Avoid the escorts." His wingman answered, voice taut. "Herr Oberleutnant, they are already diving on us." And then the world erupted. The first Mustang came in from above, cannons blazing. Hartmann jerked his stick, the G-forces crushing his chest. Tracers tore past his canopy, glowing like meteors. The sky was a kaleidoscope of death, machine gun lines intersecting, vapor trails twisting, the sun flashing off wings like mirrors of doom. He dived through the melee, letting gravity do the work. The air howled. He felt the familiar tremor of compressibility as his Messerschmitt approached the edge of control. Below him, the bombers loomed, massive, lumbering beasts vomiting flak and smoke. Hartmann picked one out, left wing engine trailing oil, and fired a half-second burst. The cannon shells struck like a hammer. The B-24 rolled and exploded in a bloom of fire. But the victory lasted only an instant. He was now the hunted. 8 Mustangs dropped from altitude, sunlight flashing on their canopies. Hartmann's wingmen scattered, vanishing into the chaos. Alone, he weaved through tracer fire, each maneuver calculated by instinct honed through hundreds of combats. He could feel the enemy's presence even when he couldn't see it, the invisible geometry of pursuit. He threw his aircraft into a vertical climb, then suddenly rolled and reversed, forcing 2 Mustangs to overshoot. One appeared directly in his sights. A flash of silver, the pilot's helmet visible for a fraction of a second. Hartmann fired. The Mustang flared into orange fragments, tumbling through its own vapor trail. But the others were still there, relentless, disciplined, silent. His warning light blinked. Fuel critical. He was out of time, out of sky. Hartmann leveled off at treetop height, racing over the blackened refineries. The roar of engines was replaced by the whistle of wind through the bullet holes. A final burst of the throttle. Then the engine coughed, sputtered, and died. He was gliding now, the Messerschmitt a lifeless shell. Ahead, the fields rippled in the heat. Behind, the Mustangs circled, watching. No one fired. They had seen enough killing for one day. Hartmann unstrapped, pulled the canopy release, and felt the rush of air hit him like a wave. The ground spiraled upward, the parachute snapping open with a violent crack. From below came the smell of oil, smoke, and summer earth. As he drifted down through the burning haze, he thought not of victory, not of survival, but of the strange fraternity that existed only among those who lived by wings and chance. To the outside world, Erich Hartmann was a prodigy of destruction. 352 kills, the highest tally in the history of aerial warfare. But the numbers were an illusion, a crude arithmetic that concealed the real secret of his survival: restraint. Hartmann never fought the way war propaganda imagined. There was no glamour in his battles, no cinematic loops or heroics. He flew as if every encounter were a duel of thought and gravity. He once told a young pilot, "In the air, the machine obeys the mind, and the mind obeys fear. Learn to make fear your ally." His doctrine was radical in its simplicity. Never engage in turning fights. Never waste altitude. Never fire unless you could see the enemy's rivets. Close to within 60 meters, close enough to smell the oil burning from his exhaust, Then fire one short burst. If you missed, you deserved to die. It wasn't arrogance, it was mathematics. Ammunition was finite. G-forces were physics. And every second spent turning in the sky meant losing energy, the one currency that could not be replenished mid-fight. Hartmann's discipline turned the air war into a science. While others sought glory, he sought invisibility. He painted the nose of his aircraft with the black tulip pattern, not as vanity, but as a lure. Enemy pilots would see it and rush in headlong, obsessed with the legend. Hartmann would let them come, climbing silently into the sun, then strike from behind in a dive so sudden that his victims never even knew he was there. From the ground, his attacks appeared instantaneous. A streak of white, a glint, an explosion, then emptiness. To his comrades, he seemed superhuman. But to those who flew beside him, the truth was colder. They spoke of the way he sat before a mission, quiet, almost detached, running his gloved finger over the edges of his map, not for luck, but for geometry. He didn't see enemies, he saw angles. Every move in the air was a prediction. Velocity, climb rate, sun position, escape vector, all computed in the human brain under the pressure of 9 Gs and death seconds away. Hartmann never chased. He waited. He let the enemy make the first mistake. The air, he told his squadron, is patient. If you rush it, it kills you. If you listen, it tells you where to strike. But even genius could not defeat the tide. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was an echo of a dying empire. The skies were filled with American bombers that never seemed to end, escorted by fresh pilots and endless fuel. Germany's own airfields were craters, its flight schools, ashes. Hartmann understood before most that no amount of individual brilliance could stop the inevitable. His 300th kill didn't bring celebration. It brought nausea. In his diary, he wrote simply, "Each plane that falls carries a man who once had a mother. What are we counting?" It was the first crack in the myth of the Blonde Knight, the moment when victory began to taste like grief. The Eastern Front was not a war, it was an extinction. Between the Volga and the Vistula, between winter and starvation, the sky itself froze with the weight of human misery. And yet, amid that vast and dying landscape, men still fought for meters of air. By the spring of 1943, Hartmann had become a constant phantom above the Russian steppes. His Messerschmitt carried the black tulip of death on its nose. Soviet pilots cursed its sight before they saw it. The Red Air Force began broadcasting warnings over open channels. Beware the black tulip. He kills from the sun. He killed because that was his task, not his will. He flew because he could not live on the ground. That morning over Kursk, the snow reflected so much light that the world looked inverted, sky and earth trading colours. Hartmann led his wing through a field of broken clouds, engines humming in synchronization. Below, a Soviet armoured column advanced, the dust of war rising like breath from the planet itself. 2 Il-2 Stormoviks appeared ahead, armoured beasts, slow but lethal with their rear gunners. He struck fast. 1 burst each, precise and clean. Both aircraft fell, leaving dark streaks across the white plain. But the second kill betrayed him. Shrapnel from the explosion shredded his radiator. The temperature gauge spiked. Steam hissed into the cockpit, blinding him. He throttled back, scanned for an open field, saw only forest and snow. The engine seized, coughing its last metallic breath. He pulled the canopy, felt the violent cold claw at his face, and brought the crippled machine down through the trees. The landing was a crash disguised as survival. The Messerschmitt skidded, tore its wings, and came to rest in a cloud of steam. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the faint crunch of boots. They found him half buried in snow, pistol drawn, uniform torn. Soviet infantry, young, hungry, their rifles shaking. One shouted in Russian, another struck him across the head. Darkness came like sleep. When he awoke, he was in a hut that smelled of sweat and frost. His hands were bound, his flight jacket gone. Through the slats of the wall, he saw his Messerschmitt smouldering, his black tulip now a ruin. He understood instantly that pilots were prizes. The Soviets interrogated him with the patience of cold men. They wanted intelligence, flight tactics, unit numbers, radio frequencies. Hartmann gave them nothing, so they left him in the snow, bleeding and unguarded, thinking he was too weak to move. He waited until night fell, until the sentry's cigarette burned low. Then he moved, slowly, methodically, every muscle an act of defiance. The rope around his wrists slipped free after hours of friction against the frost. When the guard turned his back, Hartmann lunged. One strike, silent. The body fell without sound, the snow swallowing everything. He ran. The forest stretched endless and indifferent. Every breath was pain, every sound a betrayal. Somewhere in that frozen labyrinth, he heard dogs, then silence again. 3 days later, starving and frostbitten, he reached a German outpost. The soldiers raised rifles. He was in rags, his face unrecognizable. One nervous private almost shot him before an officer recognized the eyes. "The black tulip," someone whispered. He collapsed in the snow, half conscious, half ghost. When he woke, he was back among comrades, fed, clothed, debriefed. But something in him had changed. The sky no longer looked infinite. It looked fragile. He flew again, because he always flew again. But now his voice on the radio was quieter, his victories fewer. He had seen the ground too closely. By the spring of 1945, the air above Germany no longer belonged to men. It belonged to ruin. Every horizon was lined with smoke, every sunrise tinted by burning cities. The Luftwaffe was no longer a force. It was a rumour carried on the wind, a handful of aces, flying machines built from spare parts and memory. Erich Hartmann had outlived them all. His Messerschmitt was dented, patched with aluminum from wrecks, the paint flaking from the once black tulip that had terrified enemies across continents. He still flew, but not for glory, not even for country, only for the discipline of flight, for the illusion that mastery could hold back oblivion. At dawn on May 8th, the radios whispered the unthinkable, "Der Krieg ist vorbei." The war is over, yet the sky that morning was still full of motion. Scattered Soviet fighters prowling the edges of surrender. American patrols mapping the borders of victory. When Hartmann took off, it was almost ritual. He didn't expect combat. He wanted one last breath of altitude before the silence. But fate, even in its exhaustion, still had precision. A Yak-9 appeared ahead, cutting through low cloud. Reflex overrode history. Hartmann rolled, closed the distance, and fired a single measured burst. The Soviet plane disintegrated. His 352nd kill, the final one. Moments later, his radio crackled. The ceasefire confirmed, all flights ordered to land immediately. He throttled back, and for the first time in years, his hands trembled. The engine's vibration felt like a heartbeat leaving his body. Below, the fields of Czechoslovakia rolled by in green and grey. He touched down on a makeshift strip crowded with refugees, burning trucks, broken discipline. Soldiers of a dying Reich, milled without orders, their insignia meaningless in the new air. That night, under the cold lantern light of a captured farm, Hartmann signed the papers of surrender. American officers treated him with wary respect, They had studied his name for years. To them, he was not an enemy, but an equation, the statistical peak of a machine that had now vanished. He believed, for a moment, that captivity under the Americans meant survival, perhaps even redemption. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, without ceremony, his unit was transferred to Soviet custody under the Allied agreement. The trucks rolled east, away from the setting sun, carrying the ghosts of the Luftwaffe toward the new empire that demanded vengeance. When the convoy crossed the Elbe, Hartmann looked back once at the western sky and whispered something no one heard. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a farewell to the only element that had ever loved him. The camps awaited interrogations, false trials, 25 years of labor. The sky, once his kingdom, was now a rumor above barbed wire. The journey east lasted 9 days. The trucks that carried the prisoners had no markings, just grey metal and the smell of diesel and defeat. The road wound through the skeletons of cities, through villages that stared without expression, through landscapes where spring had arrived, but no one had noticed. They reached a camp beyond the Volga, a wasteland of timber huts and iron fences, set against a sky that seemed too vast for mercy. The Soviets called it corrective labor. The men called it what it was, slow erasure. For years, Hartmann's world shrank to 3 things: the weight of a shovel, the rhythm of breath in the cold, and the memory of flight. He worked in frozen quarries, built roads that led nowhere, cut wood for furnaces that never warmed. He watched men vanish one by one, taken by hunger, disease, or the casual whim of guards. At night, he would close his eyes and imagine the vibration of an engine through his bones. The sound became his prayer, his heartbeat, his rebellion. They interrogated him endlessly. The Soviets accused him of war crimes, of strafing civilians, of killing prisoners, of atrocities that had never existed outside propaganda. He refused to confess. They threatened execution. He laughed once, softly, and said, "If you kill me, at least I'll be closer to the sky." Years became numbers. 10 passed, then 12, then 20. In 1955, under Khrushchev's amnesty, he was released. A train carried him west through the ruins of the empire he had once served. The stations were full of silence, men returning to nations that no longer remembered them. When Hartmann stepped onto the platform in West Germany, no fanfare greeted him. He was thinner, greyer, his hands still scarred from labor. Yet when he looked up, his eyes followed the vapor trail of a jet cutting across the stratosphere. He smiled faintly. The world had moved on. The sky had changed its language. He was invited to join the new Luftwaffe of the Federal Republic, NATO's air force now, not Hitler's. He accepted without hesitation. It wasn't loyalty to a flag, it was the simple truth that he could not live without flight. They gave him a new uniform, a new aircraft, a new insignia. But when he climbed into the cockpit of the American-built F-86 Sabre, he paused before takeoff. The controls felt familiar. Different metal, same heartbeat. The air still had that same taste of oil and sunlight. His students revered him, called him Der Alte, the Old One. He taught them that flight was not about aggression, but understanding. "Speed is useless without clarity," he would say. "You win when you see the truth faster than the other man." He retired in 1970, lived quietly with his wife Ursula. When he died in 1993, the newspapers called him the greatest ace who ever lived. But those who had known him said he never spoke of victories, only of survival. 4 years later, in 1997, the Russian Federation officially cleared his name of all charges. It was a gesture too late for the man, but perhaps not too late for the sky. History remembers numbers because they are easy to count. It forgets silence because silence cannot be tallied. Erich Hartmann's life existed between those two absolutes, the arithmetic of war and the quiet of consequence. 352 victories, each one cleanly recorded in reports, logbooks, and propaganda. Yet none of those pages carried the sound of the last breath or the brief flare of flame reflected in his visor. He once said, to no one in particular, "If I must be remembered for numbers, then remember that I also stopped firing when I could." In every engagement, he lived by a paradox. The closer he came to perfection, the further he drifted from meaning. Each kill made him safer, yet smaller. Each success carved away something invisible. By the end, he had become what the air demanded: pure reaction, pure calculation, stripped of anger or joy. The omniscient sky, if it had a conscience, might have seen him as an instrument rather than a man, a lens through which the century observed its own madness. War is rarely about hatred. It is about geometry, resource, exhaustion, and the obedience of the human spirit to something colder than morality. Hartmann understood that. He never claimed righteousness. He never apologized for survival. His students in the post-war Luftwaffe asked him what he had learned from 1,404 combat missions. He told them, "Skill keeps you alive. Character decides whether that life means anything." Then he would pause, letting the hum of jet engines fill the silence, a sound older than his wisdom. Hartmann's strategic genius was not in his tactics, but in his acceptance of limitation. He knew that even mastery bends to entropy. The Luftwaffe, once supreme, had died not through lack of courage, but through exhaustion of fuel, of men, of time. He had witnessed the truth of every empire, that victory demands more than courage, it demands endurance, and endurance is mortal. And yet, even in his later years, when he watched jet fighters carve contrails higher than he had ever flown, he felt no envy. He would watch the sky as if listening for a memory. The sound he waited for was not the roar of engines, but the faint electric silence that exists between seconds in a dive, that fraction of eternity when gravity and will are equal. That was where he had truly lived. When all the wings have fallen and the sky forgets their names, only one truth remains. In war, no one truly wins. Some merely fall more slowly.